I've been walking in my sleep and counting trouble instead of counting sheep. Where the years went, I can't say. I just turned around and they've gone away. And I've been sifting through the layers of dusty books and faded papers that tell a story I used to know. It was one that happened so long ago. It's gone away in yesterday, and I find myself on the mountainside where the rivers change direction across the great divide. Well, I heard the owl calling softly as the night was falling with a question, and I replied, but he's gone across the borderline. He's gone away in yesterday, and I find myself on the mountainside where the rivers change direction across the great divide. The finest hour that I have seen is the one that comes between the edge of night and the break of day, when the darkness rolls away. It's gone away in yesterday, and I find myself on the mountainside where the rivers change direction across the great divide. It's gone away in yesterday, and I find myself on the mountainside where the rivers change direction across the great divide.
Well, here we are at the Great Divide, a divide that's been created by ourselves. On one side is our past, on the other side is our future. And the question for us is, will we, like the owl, move on, cross the borderline into the other world we all hope lies for us after death? Or will we continue on in that finest hour, just at the break of day, when we see life, when we see light? What changes will we make? So that's what this presentation is about. It's about climate change, so you can understand something about climate change. It's to help you deal with your own feelings about it. And it's about how to plan to carry out micro, mezzo, and macro social work that takes climate change into account. Well, my name is George Appenzeller. I'm a social worker, have been one for many, many years. Graduated from the University of South Carolina College of Social Work, where I incidentally met my wife, who is also a social worker. And when I decided to close both my macro and my micro practice, I just decided that I would start something new, a practice that would be devoted to environmental issues, but particularly devoted to climate change, because it's so important. In the years that I spent in practice, I spent much of that time in the wilderness with children who needed help. Not wilderness therapy, but therapy in the wilderness, along with my wife, other social workers, and our constant companion, llamas, who acted both as pack animals, so young children could go with us, and who also acted as therapy animals for the children, then I'll have to say for us too. We also, my wife and I, traveled sometimes with our youngest son around the world, doing research projects as volunteers, scientific research, particularly on climate change and human impact on our environment. In that process, we learned a great deal, and I got to observe changes over a 30-year period, more than 30 years, close to 35-year period, changes that were happening due to human interference with the way that nature operates. And so I know social work, but I also know the world and know the natural world. Not as a scientist, I'm certainly not that qualified, but as someone who is interested and as someone who is a social worker. So what I hope that we'll learn some about today are what are climate and climate change? What are those things? And how social work and connected to climate change? What do they have to do with each other? We'll learn some from the past. This is not the first time we've had abrupt climate change. What will be the changes, what will be the effects of the changes on South Carolina over the next 10 to 50 years? What does climate change look like? What does it physically look like? And then, most importantly, what can we do? So first, to what is climate and what is climate change? So what is climate? Well, climate of a region, like the southeastern U.S., is the typical or average weather. Put it all together and average it, and that's what climate is. For example, the climate of Hawaii is sunny and warm. The climate of Colombia is often sunny, usually hot, and very damp. You put all of those regional climates together, and you have what, if you average it, you have what the Earth's climate is. So what is climate change? Well, climate change is a change in the average weather of a region. For example, if Alaska became like Hawaii, that would be climate change. And climate change on a worldwide basis is Earth's overall climate. There could be a change in Earth's average temperature, for example, which has often happened in Earth's history. What causes climate change? Well, one thing that causes it is variations in the amount of energy coming from the sun and hitting the Earth. That happens on a pretty regular basis, and there are some ups and downs. Usually nothing very spectacular, however. It can also be changes in the reflectivity of Earth's atmosphere and surface. For example, now that we don't have much of the North Pole and the South Pole is getting smaller, then that ice, that whiteness, can't reflect back into space the amount of light, the amount of heat that's hitting the Earth. And then there are changes in the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect affects the amount of heat that's retained in Earth's atmosphere. The greenhouse effect is very important. Basically, when the sun reaches the Earth, some of it is absorbed into the surface of either the Earth itself, ground, or the oceans, and the rest is reflected back into the atmosphere. Greenhouse gases prevent the warmth from this energy from escaping our atmosphere. That's what the greenhouse effect is. Greenhouse gases are what keeps the heat from the sun from passing back into space. The gases generally are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and ozone, the most significant ones, although there are others now, like refrigerants, things from our refrigerator. When we get rid of our refrigerator, those gases escape. And these are very powerful gases, although they're more short-lived than the ones that traditionally have have been the greenhouse gases. Without the greenhouse effect, this would be a very cold place. But with too much greenhouse effect, it's a very hot place. So where do those gases come from? Well, in the past, they came from volcanoes and other natural outgassing. Any of you who have been into a hot water kind of a lake or something of that sort, been to hot springs up in North Carolina, you've been in the presence of outgassing. That water is made warm by being down in the earth and by these gases passing through it. This time, though, with the climate change we're undergoing, humans are the ones who are causing the gases. They're causing the gases by taking carbon and methane that's been sequestered under the ground and at the bottom of the ocean for many, many, many thousands of years, and they're releasing it into the atmosphere. Because it's human releases of greenhouse gases, it's called anthropogenic. That is the influence of humans on nature. As gases, especially carbon dioxide, move up into the atmosphere, then the temperature goes up. You can see this chart that starts in 1880 and goes to 2019. On the right-hand side are the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And the red line is the carbon dioxide. The black line is the temperature. And you can see that the temperature has increased presently by about 1.1, a little bit more than that now, degrees centigrade. And the two are closely related. We now have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than has been in the atmosphere for at least 600,000 years, possibly more than that. So how are social work and climate change connected? Social work's primary goal is to help people in need and to address social problems. That's right in the NASW Code of Ethics, one at the heart of the Code of Ethics. The biggest social problem that we face, by far, put coronavirus aside, it's not going to kill anywhere near as many people as climate change might. That's the biggest social issue that our civilization faces. What to do about climate change? It will affect those with limited resources even more than those who have resources. So these issues are social work issues, these issues of how does civilization face it, what happens as climate change continues and as it grows stronger. So climate change is not just a science issue, it's our issue, it's everybody's issue. We can learn from science what's happening and even some ideas about what we can do about it, but it's our job to help the people who are affected by climate change, not the scientists' job, our job. The people affected by climate change usually aren't new clients. They're the ones we have already. To serve them now and in the future, we have to take climate change into account. It's too late not to have climate change. It's already happening. We see it every day, and we see the negative effects. As Bill McKibben, someone who is very familiar with you who do follow climate change issues, says, we're not playing for stopping climate change. We're playing maybe for being able to slow it down to the point where it doesn't make civilizations impossible. When you decide to be a social worker, you're deciding to protect and expand a caring civilization. That's what we do. So what can we learn from the past? What is out there that will give us an idea of what's happening and what's going to happen? Well, probably the most important thing we can look at is the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the PETM. It is what is closest in our past, the Earth's past, to what is happening now. Happened about 55 million years ago. In a matter of a few thousand years, these huge amounts of carbon, probably coming from volcanoes, were injected into the atmosphere, and the global temperatures rose between 5 and 8 degrees. That is 5 and 8 degrees centigrade. That caused rapid climate change. It disrupted the weather. It transformed landscapes. It acidified the oceans. It triggered a big extinction. And it took more than 150,000 years for the world to recover from that. Humans were not around then, but humans can learn from what happened. So there are parallels with today. We've been burning all these fossil fuels. We've produced the same kind of carbon isotope that scientists find in the 55-million-year-old rocks. The ocean has become more acidic. It's losing oxygen. There are die-offs going on within the oceans. I'm sure all of you have heard about the coral die-off, so that's more caused by the heating of the ocean. There have been dramatic weather extremes. In my lifetime, I've seen a tremendous change in these extremes. There are deadly heat waves, there's severe storms, there are droughts. There are places in the world where the droughts have completely changed things, and we'll see a little bit about that later. There are hurricanes. And hurricanes aren't necessarily there aren't necessarily more hurricanes, but they're more deadly hurricanes. There are more intense hurricanes. There are hurricanes that especially have more water in them and dump that water on the land, and that creates things like what happened in the PD in South Carolina and the southeastern part of North Carolina last year and 2 years before that, what happened in Houston not that long ago, what happened in New Orleans, and so on. So in response to these shifts in the weather, plants and animals are showing up in new places. They tend to move up into the mountains and move north because it's cooler. And so plants that would have been just in Florida up until 20, 30 years ago, you can find in Georgia now. You can even find plants in the mountains that didn't used to be there. I've seen that happen over the last 30 years. There's even some evidence that species are getting smaller as a result of the warmer climate. When the weather gets warmer and stays that way over time, animals do get smaller. So if you go down to Cumberland Island, Georgia, and look at the deer, Cumberland Island stays warm all year round, you'll find deer that are about the size of a fair-sized dog. If you go up into the mountains of South Carolina, you'll find deer who are bigger than ones that you'll find in the Midlands of South Carolina. There's been a lot of research done on this recently, and it's certainly showing up in birds because there are a lot of specimens of birds, so scientists can look at them. So changes are happening even in the size of the animals. and the oceans are rising. Anybody who's from Charleston knows that. But there are also some differences with the PETM. We're changing things much more quickly than happened in the PETM. It took place over somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 years. What's going on now is happening over a couple of hundred years. The biggest changes, most of the change that's going on has happened in the last 20 years, and it's been particularly evident in the last 10 years. Humans have been living in a climatic sweet spot, a sweet spot that allowed us to develop civilization. If you look at this chart closely, you'll see at the far right-hand side where the red line is, in comparison to the past, it's been pretty much the same. It's been predictable. We can predict as humans when the spring was coming, when the winter was coming, when we had to put things away, when we needed to grow things, when to plant our seeds, and when to build buildings, and so on. That has allowed us to create civilization. Now that right-hand side is in thousands of years, so that happened, about 20,000 years ago, thereabouts, and maybe a little bit less. And it just made a huge difference in our history, because before then, in the maybe 200,000 years that humans had been around before then, we had to keep moving because the weather was such, because the climate was such, that things changed, and we couldn't predict what was going to be happening. So what are going to be some of the effects on South Carolina over the next 10, 50 years of climate change? Well, there are going to be a number of direct effects, and we're going to look at these one at a time. But as you can see, they are things that affect humans, but affect the entire world. And the population most at risk of these effects are the kind of people who we serve, the older people, young people, toddlers, let's say, poor people who don't have the means to protect themselves, the medically and psychologically fragile, and disabled folks. These are all people who we work with. One of the first places or things that will be affected are insects and diseases. Now, nobody likes ticks. They're a real pain to have around. But as you can see from this map, starting over here and starting in 2020, there is a higher establishment probability of ticks in areas where there haven't been very many before. Down in Florida, along the coast, both Georgia and South Carolina and so on, there have been ticks, for a long time. But by 2020, by this year, they'd moved inland, and they'd moved up in some areas to higher altitudes. And by 2080, they're going to have spread over much of the east, and the same kind of thing is happening in the west. Well, what's the problem with that besides the ticks biting you? Well, ticks carry a lot of diseases. I've spent a lot of time on coastal islands, the wilderness islands, along with my wife and with taking college students down there to study the areas. And in that time, my wife has gotten both Rocky Mountain spotted fever and some other diseases caused by ticks. Another insect that carries a lot of diseases are mosquitoes. And the number of days that mosquitoes can transmit diseases has increased quite a bit, particularly since about 1970. As you can see here on this chart in Colombia, there are 11 more days when insects can bite you and pass diseases along to you than there were in 1970. So between 1970 and 2017, there were 11 more days. And as time goes on, there'll be even more days. Temperature change. Well, temperature change is an obvious effect of climate change. Let's talk a little bit about it. When I was going to elementary school and middle school and high school in Columbia back in the 1950s, there was about an even number of days when we set cold records as there were that we set hot records. But if you'll take a look here, you can see that in the 2010s, the decade of the 2010s from 2001 to 2010, that the number of records set for hot days far exceeded those that were set for cold days. So it's getting hotter. In fact, in Colombia, the average temperature has increased by 2.7 degrees in that same period of time, where in South Carolina in general, it's increased by 2 degrees, and in the US by 2.5 degrees. Now that may not seem like much, but it really makes quite a bit of difference. One of the things it makes a difference with is food supply. There are those who say that having more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will increase the amount of food production. Well, that's actually inaccurate. What will increase is the rate of growth of the plants. And that rate of growth of the plants keeps the plants from producing as many seeds, as much of the food that we eat as they currently do. So between the year 2000 and the year 2050, it's estimated that we'll have 24% less corn available, and 3% less wheat, and 11% less rice, although that particular one is being questioned at this point, and 9% fewer potatoes. Well, what difference does it make with these different things? Well, as it turns out, somewhere between 60 and 70% of the calories that people eat and take into their body are from these 4 crops. So as these crops go down, we'll have less food. It's also important how many days rather we have under 32 degrees, because a lot of crops are dependent on having cold weather, days below freezing, in order to grow and to produce the foods that we eat. For example, a small example, I suppose, I now live in North Carolina, near Chapel Hill, and I used to grow asparagus. Well, I can't grow asparagus anymore because asparagus requires a certain number of days below 32 degrees. But the same thing is true of peaches and of plums and of cherries and when and many other crops. And when the number of days under 32 degrees becomes smaller, as you can see from the chart at the 2 charts at the bottom and at the top, then it'll be much harder to get those particular sources of food. Sea level rise is one of the often talked about effects of climate change. If you happen to live in Charleston, you have seen over the years, and you're old enough, you have seen over the years many more days when the streets are flooded than there used to be. This chart shows that. In the period 2005 to 2014, that the number of days compared to, say, 55 to 64, they've about increased maybe 500% there. Some of that is caused naturally. There have always been some flooding since Charleston is built on filled land for the most part. But most of it is human caused because of the increase of the volume of the ocean and of the height of the ocean from melting glaciers and just expansion because the ocean is hotter now. And some of it is caused by there being bigger storms. Whatever the specific cause is, it's all related to climate change, and it means Charleston's going to have to change a lot, and they already have a plan for doing that. Water supply is a big problem in much of the country, becoming worse all the time, in part, large part due to climate change, but also due to increase in population. But that's not so true in South Carolina. In South Carolina, we'll have kind of a mix, are having a mix. It's already happening. The chart on the right shows that it is happening. On the left, rather. The chart on the right, some parts of the state are going to decrease somewhere up to 2.5% in the amount of water, but some parts are going to increase. The ones that are going to increase are the ones that are getting flooding from having massive water events or rain events. Those rain events are causing flooding, and that in turn is causing problems for people, people who lose their homes, people who lose their businesses. The most obvious effects of climate change are extreme weather events. Since the 1980s, the number of extreme weather events in South Carolina up through 2010, well, actually, I'm sorry, that's 2010 to 2019. The number of extreme weather events has increased by 2.5 times. Billion-dollar disasters specifically. These disasters are really incredible, and I'm sure many of you are quite aware of that, and you've seen that, and you perhaps have suffered from that. Those events include hurricanes, extreme rain events, tornadoes, all the kinds of things that we've always been afraid of, but which haven't happened in the past at the rate they're happening now. Most people haven't thought about how increased heat and humidity is going to impact outdoor work. It's having already a big effect. Now, interestingly enough, the number of extreme heat days, that is, days with heat indexes over 90 degrees, in Columbia has not been as much as it has been in some other parts of the country, and even in other parts of the Carolinas. Well, I think that's because Columbia has always had high heat indexes, anywhere from beginning in April and running on through September, maybe into October. It's added 15 more days, though, since 1979. There are some places in the country that we can learn lessons from, as there are more and more days with these high heat indexes, and that is that people are simply unable to work or play outside during the day. The reason they're unable to do it is because there are big dangers in having high heat indexes. Even at 80 plus, on up to 90, there's dehydration. I think all of us have had that happen to us at some time. At 90 plus, you get heat cramps. Anyone who's ever had heat cramps knows how painful that may be. At 105 plus, you have heat exhaustion. You might end up in the hospital. At 130 plus, you have heat stroke. 130 plus is getting to be not that unusual in many places, including Columbia and other parts of South Carolina. At 130 plus, if you had a heat stroke, you can die. I've treated some people with heat stroke and helped to treat them. And it's really a very dangerous situation because when there's a certain amount of moisture in the air and a certain amount of heat, and you put those together and get the heat index, it doesn't matter how much you drink, it doesn't matter how much you sweat. The sweat will not leave your body because there's so much moisture in the air that there's nowhere for it to go. And then you end up with heat exhaustion or heat stroke. In some places in Arizona, particularly in New Mexico, they don't work outside during the day anymore, particularly in the summer. They work at night. People don't run during the day, they run at night. Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops don't take hikes during the day, they take them at night. People set up their camps if they're camping and stay in their tents or stay under shelter of some kind, tarps or whatever, during the day, and they do their outdoor activities they're going to do out in the woods at night. Another major problem that we'll be seeing, and we're already seeing it to some extent, is a limited power supply. As the country, the world, the Southeast, South Carolina, become hotter, there'll be a greater reliance on air conditioning for people to not just be comfortable, but also to survive. And that the amount that's needed is calculated by engineers as cooling degree days. We don't have enough energy supply to provide all the cooling degree days that we're going to need in the very near future. We don't even have enough to provide what we need right now in some parts of the country. The blue dots that you see on here, the blue areas, are the places that will have the most difficulty because the price of electricity, of power, is going to go up, and the people in these areas don't have much money, and therefore it will be harder for them to provide the cooling that they need to have. If you'll take a look there at South Carolina going on up into North Carolina, that runs right along the I-95 corridor, which of course is the poorest part of the state. This can turn into a really dangerous situation. And you'll also notice that up in West Virginia, there's a lot of that because West Virginia is a very poor state. And you'll notice the large areas, those are Indian reservations, where they don't even have power at all in many of these reservations. So this is going to become a bigger and bigger issue, particularly as we try to ramp up on sustainable power, which is doing better, but we still have quite a ways to go. And something that's rarely talked about are climate change refugees. Many of the refugees that have come into Europe or that are trying to come here are escaping from climate change results. For example, in the Central American countries, there's been a huge drought, particularly in the high plains, where people have made their living through subsistence farming for thousands of years. That's why so many people coming to the Mexican-American border don't speak Spanish. They speak Indian languages. They come from those areas. It's also big companies have been taking over a lot of the farms, and which also has added to it. But the biggest part of it is because of climate change. Now, that's not to say that everybody is trying to escape climate change, but many are. The Syrian civil war began because of climate change issues with a big drought. and people moving into the cities and then demanding resources, and then they didn't get them, and then they rebelled, and then we had this big war. Similar thing is happening in Kenya. In the United States, well, let's take just South Carolina as an example. We're going to have climate change refugees. We already have climate change refugees. People who live right on the shore, many of whom on the sea islands are not wealthy people by any means. They're people that have been there for many generations, and they were getting by. But the ocean has risen, and it's taken their homes, or it's taken their livings, and they've had to go elsewhere. So they're refugees. There'll be more and more of these as time goes on. People in Charleston already are moving to higher ground. How are we going to help these folks? What are we going to do to make sure that they are able not just to survive, but also to prosper at a time when they have lost most of what they had? So what does climate change physically look like? I'm going to show you some pictures that I've taken, one of many thousands probably, in various parts of the world, in Mongolia, Siberia, New Zealand, Patagonia, many parts of the United States, Canada, some pictures of these places where climate change has already made a big difference. This particular picture is of a river in Mongolia in what is now desert country, or what's known as near desert, because it's almost there, probably is there by now since this was taken 5 or 6 years ago. And you can see what's happened with this river. You can see where the banks used to be, and you can see this herd of horses trying to get a drink. Herds of other animals came down to this water in the 3 weeks or so that I was living along with my wife and with a clan of one of the tribes that are nomads in this area. We had to take our water from this river also. We were able to filter it. We filtered it 2 or 3 times, and we also put things into the water, iodine specifically, that would help kill the bacteria. But this is a bad situation. People just don't have a way to get the water, and this is an occurrence all over the world. This picture taken on Christmas Day a number of years ago, and a group of other people and I hiked down to a glacial front along a lake bed, beautiful lake, beautiful place in Patagonia, where these folks are standing. These are folks from all over the world, from Great Britain, Australia, Turkey, various places, Korea, so on. Where they are standing is where the glacier used to be. So the glacier is moving back as it melts, and that's going to have tremendous impacts over time, downstream, once the glacier goes away, even when it gets about half the size it is now, because there won't be water for them to irrigate their crops. This is the Big Bend country in the Big Bend area of Texas. It's a national park. If you'd been here 20,000 years ago, you would have seen big trees and lots of wildlife. But when the glacial fronts moved back after the end of the most recent ice glaciation period, the rain stopped and it turned into desert. What's interesting about this is it's a great example of what happens with climate change, because those trees, those plants, and those animals moved up into some high mountains, very near to where I'm standing here when I took this picture, into high mountains where they were able to survive, and they survive to this day. And these are unique species now. They're a species of bear and a species of deer that are found nowhere else, along with a number of other animals and plants. So it's a great place to study climate change because it's happened here already. And one more picture that is indicative of what can happen with climate change is this other picture from Mongolia, one of the tribe's people with his camel and his horse in a sandstorm. When areas dry out and the winds come along, the grass that used to hold the sand, hold the earth in place is gone, and you get these massive dust storms, these massive sandstorms. These go all the way down to near Beijing in China, which is what, 2,000–3,000 miles away. This will be happening here. It's happened here before. It happened in the 1930s when there was a big drought in the Midwest. And they really are quite destructive. Hard to breathe in these things. So enough doom and gloom. What can we do about it? There's an organization that is administered by the College of Social Work at the University of South Carolina called the American Academy of Social Work. The American Academy of Social Work carries out social welfare's rather grand challenge, which is a program to come up with ideas. How can we deal with a variety of things, everything from child abuse to climate change? And what they've come up with around climate change of very much this is very much of a small part of what all they say, but it's kind of the heart of it, is that social work roles of climate change range from the micro to the macro, along the whole spectrum of things that social workers do. And that we need climate-informed social workers throughout practice, and also in research and in teaching. So there are three broad areas where social work can become involved. One is mitigation. That's limiting environmental change. That is largely a political process. That's getting Congress to take a look at it, to do something about it. It's getting the United States to go back to agreeing with other countries that we do need to limit environmental change. There's adaptation, which is building coping capacity in communities and among individuals, and resilience before things get real bad. And then finally, treatment, which is alleviating the problems that are caused for individuals and groups because of the impacts of climate change. In the area of treatment, which is micropractice, we need to provide health, mental health, physical relief and support and all those kinds of things when there is a crisis, like a hurricane or a heat wave, whatever it may be. So we as social workers need to learn all that we can of what needs to be done. We need to join local relief organizations, be volunteers to help with that, or go to work with someone like the Red Cross. And we need to help our own organization we work with or where we go to school to plan how to take care of its clients, its students, even with families, their family members, when these crises occur. An awful lot of the impact of climate change is in making bad situations even worse. So we need to be aware of that and in providing the kind of support that we do to clients. It should be a routine part of our social work activities. It's the kind of things we already do, but multiplied. Climate change is a great multiplier of problems. So for example, a counselor or therapist providing treatment for someone who is already depressed or anxious and where climate change and worrying about climate change, just like worrying about coronavirus, makes their situation even worse. We have to ask them, are you bothered by climate change? Is that something we also need to talk about or work with? If we're working with poor families, as another example, being sure they have a way to stay cool and a way to stay warm in the different times of the year, not just because it's all being made worse by climate change. Some people, especially younger people, are very affected by climate change. They are depressed, they're anxious, because climate change is very scary, and they're the people, you're the people who are going to have to live with it. I'm not going to be here a whole lot longer. I'd like to be here forever, but that's not going to happen. So it's not going to affect me as much as it is young people. So there's good reason for them to be worried about it. We have to help them in working their way through that and being able to do something positive. We need to do things, as another example, as arranging for wellness checks on older clients, especially during heat events. There have been some studies, specifically in Chicago and New York, where they had big heat events, and in buildings where wellness checks occurred, older people didn't die. But in ones where they didn't occur, older people did die. Adaptation, mezzo practice, we need to reduce the vulnerability of what here says social and biological systems, that is our social systems and ourselves, and offset the effects of climate change. It's things like air conditioning and better levees, retreating from the ocean, all the social programs like food stamps that we have to help people in crisis. We need to support the staffs of towns, cities, counties, state governments, because they're often younger and they're more aware than their bosses of what needs to happen. We need to use real data and appeal to the future of people's progeny. People want their grandchildren to do well, and we need to appeal to that. And we need to find and work with community coalitions that are making changes locally. An awful lot can happen locally. We don't have to depend on the national government for everything. We aren't going to get it, for one thing, at least not at the moment. We need to help the towns and cities and states, which are really responding in many great ways, certainly in the area I live in. And many places have community coalitions that are working on these problems. A fellow named Roy Scranton has written quite a bit about climate change, and his take on it is that we need to learn to live with it. We need to learn to live with and through the end of our current civilization. And by that he means we need to learn to accept and adapt, not just to climate change, but to other people, and be helpful to other people, and to do the things that make us more human. Now, maybe he's being a little optimistic about what folks will do, but I think he's on the right track. And finally, we get to mitigation, macro practice. Policy, not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world, is running far behind what policies we need to have to stop climate change, to make it less worse than it's going to be if we don't do something. And that is not happening right now. We all have a voice. Fortunately, we live in a country where you do have a voice. And we can say things to our elected officials and to our unelected officials, for that matter. We can use our professional organizations and their positions of authority and other organizations and our personal contacts and our community contacts to try to get policy change made. Of greatest importance is ultimately reducing and eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. With the present plans that are in place, we will reach 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in temperature in about 12 to 13 years. And when that happens, or as that happens, things get much worse. we've only gone up about 1.1 degrees, and you see what's happened. And this is not like adding, it's not arithmetic. As the degrees increase, then more harm comes from more addition than simply an arithmetic continuation of what we see. At the same time, we need to take care of ourselves because just like everybody else, we need to take care of our family, we need to pay for our mortgage, we need to pay for our student loans, we need to go to the grocery store. Well, that's kind of hard to do right at the moment. At the same time, taking on our clients and our own anxiety and depression. So we really do need to take care of ourselves. A few years ago, one of my classmates from graduate school and I both got cancer at about the same time. My friend, John Yeager, had stage 4 bladder cancer. I had stage 3 prostate cancer. John was not expected to live, and I was real close to moving over into stage 4, and then I wouldn't have been expected to live. But we fought it, and we won, at least for the moment. And we agreed while we were in the process of fighting it that when we were through, we were going to climb Mount Washington. And for those of you who do any mountain climbing and backpacking and that sort of thing, you'll know that Mount Washington is about the toughest summit to make in the East. Well, as I say, we did recover, at least for the moment, and we did climb Mount Washington. So you have to set some goals for yourself like that. Don't let climate change and other problems rule your life. Set some goals that will make you happy, that will make you feel accomplished, that will make you feel like you've done something that you really care about. So no matter what happens, we need to make our lives as meaningful and full of joy as we can. So let's keep on dancing.
After 6 hours of school, I had enough for the day. I hit the radio dial and tuned it up all the way. I gotta dance, 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 now the beat's really hot. Dance, 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 right there in the spot. Dance, 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 now the beat's really hot. Dance, dance, dance.
So thank you all very much.
Dance, yeah. When I feel put down, I try to shake it off.